Hello and welcome to my presentation for Critical Costume. My name is Veronica and I'm presenting a paper entitled Masquerading as Portia, examining the history and highlighting the agency of Ellen Terry's red silk legal robes. As the title indicates, my paper focuses on a specific costume and explores its biography and sort of the ways it evolved over the course of its lifetime. And in a sense, although I'm exploring the history of one costume, I'm actually exploring the interconnected history of several costumes. And through that, I'm trying to highlight the role that extant costumes and engaging with extant costumes can play in our understanding of theatre history. I'll begin by giving you some background to the wearer of these costumes, which is Ellen Terry. She's one of the leading actresses of the 19th and early 20th century. And she was particularly famous for her Shakespearean roles, and also the 22 years she spent performing alongside Sir Henry Irving as the leading lady of the Lyceum Company in London, which was between 1878 and 1902. But significantly for this paper and her Portia costume, her performances as Portia extend beyond those parameters. She first performed the role in 1875 and continued to perform the role until well after her retirement from the Lyceum Company, almost until the early 1920s when she retired from the stage. So the role of Portia expanded beyond her status as the leading lady of the Lyceum Theatre and became almost inseparable from the celebrity actress Ellen Terry herself. To turn to that first production, it took place at the Prince of Wales Theatre in 1875, and as this quote from Alice Comyns Carr, who was in the audience, indicates, Terry's performance was a triumph, both visually and in terms of her acting ability. The production itself was a financial failure, not least because the actor playing Shylock was not up to the task, but visually it was deemed stunning, and it was actually staged at the peak of the aesthetic movement. And members of the aesthetic movement who loved the visual appearance of it actually tried to keep it on stage by fundraising. They were ultimately unsuccessful, but the reputation of the production and the reputation of Terry's success in the role survived beyond that original production within the public memory, and that's significant to the discussions that will follow in this paper. To focus in on that original costume, and I want to give you time to look at this image so it stays in your mind, we have here Terry on the left-hand side wearing an open gown in silk damask with sort of heavy hanging sleeves that narrow at the wrist. Underneath this, she wears a straight robe or tunic, which is defined at the waist with a pleated sash, and that tunic has a high collar decorated with a pair of acorns and with a sort of infill white collar at the neckline. To top the outfit off, she wears a cap. In this case, it's a round cap made from cotton velvet. That cap material will change, but the constituent parts of the outfit you see here will be continued through the iterations of the costumes that we examine in subsequent slides. This first costume and the production itself was designed by Edward William Godwin, himself a leading member of the aesthetic movement. And his design sort of set the blueprint for the costumes that follow. And the costumes that follow include this costume you see on the slide here, worn in 1879 for Terry's second performance as Portia. This was a really important moment in her career because it was 1 year into her partnership with Irving at the Lyceum Theatre, which had begun in 1878, and it needed to be a triumph. What is interesting about this production, in terms of the parallels between the costumes and what must be acknowledged, is that apparently, according to the personal assistant of Henry Irving, Bram Stoker, they had 3 weeks to pull it together. Now, the truth of that could be debated, but regardless, if they had a very short time to put the costumes and set together, it is understandable that we do see these strong visual parallels between the 1875 costume and the 1879 costume. However, I am arguing here that the reasoning behind those visual parallels is not just practical, it's also serving a deeper purpose. And that is, it is deliberately, through these visual parallels, reawakening and invoking, in a sense, the ghosts of Terry's previous triumph from 1875. And reawakening the memories associated with these ghosts and carried by these ghosts in the mind of her audience. So to draw on Carlson's concept of ghosting, I'm trying to argue here that Terry is deliberately trying to sort of support her performance and secure its success by using the halo effect those visual echoes bring with them and sort of reenacting the 1875 performance through the 1879 costume. And you can see these visual parallels both on the slide here and on the slides that follow. One of the most obvious parallels for the audience would have been the colour. And this costume, like the first one, was black, the sober-suited lawyer's gown that you see captured here in Wilde's sonnet. Equally, we have the same constituent parts. We have that open gown, we have the straight tunic underneath, defined at the waist with a sash, the upright collar with its 2 acorns, and the circular cap. We have a different designer, Patience Harris, who ran the company Augustus C, but she is deliberately or definitely referring to Godwin's designs. She has changed some elements. You can see them here on this slide here. The gown is made from a different material, ordered from a leading maker, Watts of Westminster, who sold exquisite silks. In this case, it's an Abbey silk brocade. And the cut of the gown sleeves are different. We haven't got that narrowing at the cuff. We've got sort of wide hanging sleeves, but everything else in terms of the silhouette and the construction is definitely paralleling that original costume. And the cap, although it's a different material, is very similar in shape and design. We also have in both the costume designed by Patience Harris and by Godwin, and in the subsequent costume that we'll discuss, these acorns at the neckline. And that upright collar, it features in many of both Terry's stage costumes and her personal garments. So what we also see is this interconnection between Terry's offstage self and her onstage self that is present in many of her costuming choices. And those acorns, although I haven't been able to discover any symbolic link between the legal profession or Venice in the Renaissance period, do still have a strong visual presence in all of the costumes. So regardless of whether they carried a symbolic meaning, their visual meaning is very clear. They are a link and an interconnection between the 3 costumes, as are the constituent parts that we see echoed in each of the 3 iterations of the costume I'm discussing. So why do I suddenly show you, having shown you 2 black versions of the costume, a red costume? That is because when I was looking for surviving examples of these costumes, I couldn't find the 1875 one or the 1879 one, but I did find this red version at Terry's former home in Smallhithe Place down in Kent. And like you, I was quite shocked by this colour. It's such a dramatic departure from these black costumes that we've seen. Why is Terry suddenly breaking with the visual parallel she's established between her performances? And in examining this costume and thinking about the materials used, the fabric choices, the construction, and what had been retained and what had been changed, I started to look for evidence, not just about what changes had been happened, but about when they'd occurred and why they might have taken place. In doing this, I began to look for imagery of the costume to sort of explore, well, when did the shift to red happen? And how was she depicted? Was she depicted in black or red? And when, and where and how? And while I was looking for images of Terry in the red costume, I came across an article which helped me establish when the shift might have taken place and begin to think about the reasons behind this change. And that was an article by Lucy Oakley, which actually focused in on a portrait, which I'll show you on the following slide. Whilst researching the portrait that Oakley had discovered, I came across this portrait by G.W. Baldry in the Garrett collection, which shows Terry in 1883 in red robes as Portia. As you'll see from this image, although the colour is different, we still have the sash at the waist, the open-fronted gown with its hanging sleeves, the round cap at the top, and those silver acorns at the neckline. I now know them to be silver, at least in the later iterations of the costume, because I see them here in this colour portrait and also in the surviving costume I showed you on the previous slide. What Oakley discovered, and what this portrait by Baldry coincides with, is that in 1883, the Lyceum Company mounted their first tour to America, and it is at this point that descriptions of Terry's costume start to describe it as pomegranate coloured, or red, or crimson. Definitely not black anymore. And in thinking about the significance of this moment in Terry's career and in the public consciousness, and also the practicalities of a tour to America, I began to build up a surmise about why the shift in colour might have happened. And what I attribute it to are several factors. Firstly, the practical factor. They are now touring overseas and around America. Carting the heavy costume, which had already been worn in multiple revivals of the production around America, was perhaps not practical. It didn't travel well. Secondly, they wanted to impress the American audience. Yes, they wanted to arrive as the Lyceum Company with an established reputation, but they also wanted it to feel like fresh material. So creating a new costume helped to cement that idea in the American public's mind of fresh costumes, fresh material, new actors, come and see our production. Also significantly, Terry now has 2 costume designers working for her at the Lyceum Company, not just Patience Harris, who loved elaborate, heavy fabrics like we see in the 1879 costume, but also Alice Commons Carr, the woman who'd witnessed her first appearance as Portia in 1875, who, unlike Harris, actually preferred aesthetic dress with its loose flowing garments, and that aesthetic style of dressing was much more closely aligned with Terry's personal taste. So having Alice Commons Carr as sort of an extra designer in the mix enabled Terry to sort of create a costume which drew a balance between the previous Portia costume, which was cemented with this idea of triumph and the ghost of that original performance, but also a costume which accorded more closely with the practical requirements of an American tour and her own personal taste in dress. But there are also other elements which complicated the discussion and I unintentionally encountered through my research, and that was the fact that it wasn't only Terry wearing this costume. There was also various appearances on canvas and in public of the costume, and it's sort of expanding its own scenography beyond the stage to the public sphere. And you see it circulating in this image by Millet. And this image has been misidentified as Terry. It does bear strong resemblance to the actress, but it's definitely not her featuring as a model here. And you'll notice that the costume, though it is definitely Terry's costume, you can see she lent it to Millet for the portrait, doesn't have the acorns at the neckline. But what it is doing, in a sense, is gaining its own agency as an object which now carries Terry's performance as Portia in its own right. It doesn't need Terry in it to invoke those memories of that original performance and to carry those ghosts in the public consciousness. And so what we're seeing is just the significance of the costume in its own right from this portrait. We also see it performing on other stages, and as I said, in the public sphere. In this instance, from this quote, we see it performing the role of a costume at a fancy dress ball, where Alice Commons Carr, the costume designer I mentioned, is wearing it so that she can masquerade as Portia. She doesn't quite succeed in recapturing Ellen Terry's seminal performance, but she does for one night get cloaked in that glamour of the Portia role and enjoy sort of pretending to be Portia, the Portia that the costume carries. Whether she was wearing the black or red robes has been really difficult to establish. I know that she wore this costume between about 1875 and 1884, but I can't establish the exact date of the costume ball. But regardless of the colour and the costume that she's wearing, she's still wearing a costume that has the agency to make her Portia for a night. And Ellen Terry herself wears the costume again at later events. In 1905, a significant year for Terry, she wore it to Shakespeare's ball in aid of the Actors' Benevolent Fund. And why this is significant for Terry is that by 1905, she's been away from the Lyceum Company for 3 years. She left it in 1902. And she's trying to rebuild her career and identity as an independent actress. She's coming towards her Jubilee year in 1906, and she wants to make a grand entrance and have a triumphant night out, and a fun night out too. So yes, you could argue it's just a practical choice on her part. She has a costume in the wardrobe, it fits her, it's comfortable, she's wearing it for the evening. But by appearing as Portia and masquerading as Portia, she is also reminding those at the ball and those that will see her in the popular press of her triumph, success rather, as the leading lady of the Lyceum Company, which is associated with this costume and is carried by this costume. So she gets to, for a night, reenact that role and all the memories connected with it. There is one further performance that I've discovered it was part of and in which it plays a significant role, and that is in 1910 when it is borrowed by Vita Sacra West to appear in a Shakespeare masque in the grounds of a grand estate in Kent. Now the masque itself is not a success, as you can see here from the description of it. There is pouring rain and it is in itself a fiasco. However, the portrait which commemorates that masque makes it triumphant and important and exciting event, and gives Vita Sacra West the chance to have a successful appearance as Portia, and one which lasts and endures in the public memory. And significantly, this portrait was not painted at the time of the masque in 1910. It was actually painted later, in around 1930, by Claire Atwood, who was living with Terry's daughter down in Kent, near Small Hythe Place. And by commemorating the event in a portrait and giving Vita Sacra West the chance to be Portia, we again see the costume taking on the role of Portia and not needing Terry to be in it to have that power to recreate the role. So to turn to its current situation, the significance of the costume in its own right, I want to just think about, well, what do costumes do once the performance is over and the original performer is dead and they're no longer on the stage, so to speak? They're on a new stage set and they've become museum objects. Why do they matter? So the way I've managed to sort of articulate that for myself is to turn to the work of Barbara Hodgson and Joseph Roach. And Hodgson really encapsulates the excitement of working with surviving costume and the ideas that they carry. And Joseph Roach, in his work on effigies in Cities on the Dead, has managed to sort of pull apart why it is that certain objects have a power in the public mind. And so what I would argue is that by having this sort of complex biography, all these histories and memories that are kind of carried by them, costumes such as the Portia robes then become endowed with the power and the magic, as you see from this quote here, to sort of remember quite literally the performer that's now missing. So the robes that you see here on a mannequin next to the bust of Terry as Portia are in a sense remembering her original performance and Terry herself. So to draw everything to a close and to sort of acknowledge some of the material that has shaped my thinking, I want to just briefly reflect on what we've discussed or what I've explored about the history and evolution of this costume and why looking at the original object and the visual iconography that surrounds it is significant. Because what I would argue I have demonstrated through this paper is that the way costumes gain agency after the original performer has gone is exactly through having been on the bodies of not just that performer, but other performers, and having appeared in multiple performances, both on the stage and within the public consciousness, whether that be on canvas or on a physical body at a fancy dress ball. And it is the ghosts and the memories they accumulate through this process that gives them the agency to remember, quite literally, both the performers and the performances they were part of. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to this paper and it's provoked some questions in your minds. If you have any ideas you want to share with me or any feedback, I'm hastily skipping back to my original slide so I can leave you with my email and my contact details. And I hope you've enjoyed this brief masquerade as Portia. Thank you for listening.